Jazzy's log, day of the stampede. No one ever thought it would come to this. We knew it was a possibility, but none of us were eager to face the truth. The war had finally come to our doorsteps. We had only weeks to prepare for the stampede, but it felt like years. We had to reinforce the farm, build up defenses, make sure everyone knew where to go in case of emergency. We had to do it all while also preparing for the inevitable. I remember the night before the stampede. I was part of a group that had been assigned to help with the preparations. We had worked non-stop for days, and now we were finally done. Even though we knew what was coming, there was still a feeling of hope in the air. But that hope was quickly extinguished when the stampede started. I had expected it to be loud and chaotic, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer violence and destruction. The sky was filled with fire and smoke, and the ground shook as bombs and missiles exploded all around us. We had no idea what was happening, but we knew there was only one thing to do: survive. We all ran for cover and huddled together, listening to the chaos around us. We could hear the screams and cries of the injured and dying, and the relentless barrage of explosions that seemed to never end. Eventually, the stampede was over. We emerged from our hiding spot to find the farm in ruins. Everywhere we looked, there was destruction and death. It was a scene that I will never forget. The aftermath of the stampede was even worse. We had to search for survivors and help the wounded. We had to bury the dead and try to rebuild what was left of our home. It was a long and painful process, but we all worked together to make it through. A few weeks later, we had finally recovered from the stampede. We had rebuilt the farm and fortified it against any future attacks. We had also learned a valuable lesson: no matter how much we prepare, we can never be fully prepared for the horrors of war. This is why I will never forget today, Jazzy's day of the stampede. It is a day that will stay with me forever, a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of coming together in times of crisis. The Kraken had been through hell and back and were still standing. The crew of the Kraken, a submarine in a post-apocalyptic universe, had managed to survive the fallout, but it had not been easy. After months of searching, the crew had finally found a safe place to call home, an ancient underwater ruin. It had been a stroke of luck that the crew had found the ruin, and they had been able to make it their own. But now, they wanted to expand their home beyond the depths of the sea. They wanted to explore the land above, to find new resources that could help them in their mission. The crew had discussed the plan for days, and had finally come to the conclusion that it was their only option. The crew of the Kraken had decided to explore the surface, and find a new home above the waves. However, the crew was soon met with a harsh reality. The surface was not what they had expected. It was a wasteland of scorched earth, the radiation from the fallout still lingering in the air. The crew had no idea how they would be able to survive in such conditions. But the crew of the Kraken was determined, and they pressed on. After weeks of searching, the crew stumbled upon an abandoned city. It was a miracle that the city had survived the fallout, and the crew was thrilled to find it. They quickly set to work, cleaning up the city and making it livable. The crew was able to find enough resources to last them for months, and the city was now a viable option for a new home. The crew of the Kraken had made it, and they had found a new home on the surface. They had found a place where they could build a new life, a place where they could finally put the horrors of the past behind them. But the crew of the Kraken had one final task to do. They had to find a way to protect their new home from the dangers of the post-apocalyptic world. They had to find a way to keep their new home safe from the dangers of the outside world. The crew of the Kraken decided to build a wall around the city, to keep out any potential threats. They also placed sentries around the perimeter of the city, to watch for any signs of danger. The crew of the Kraken had created a safe haven for themselves, a place where they could finally start to rebuild their lives. The crew of the Kraken had found a new home, a safe place to call their own. They had survived the fallout, and now they were ready to start their new lives. The crew of the Kraken had done what many thought was impossible, and they had found a new life in the ruins of the post-apocalyptic world. The sun rose, casting a pale orange hue across the sky. The world had changed since the bombs had dropped, the sea filled with radioactive waste and the air thick with the smell of death. The world was no longer the same as it used to be. John was a fisher, one of the few survivors who had managed to survive the fallout. He had been fishing since before the bombs dropped, and he had managed to stay alive by scavenging the seas for what little fish still swam in the toxic waters. John had become accustomed to the post-apocalyptic world, but the memories of what it had once been still haunted him. He could still remember the days when he had gone out with his family on the boat, the days when the air was free of the stench of death and the waters were teeming with life. But those days were long gone. John had adapted to the new world, and he had found that fishing was his only way to survive in the post-apocalyptic world. He no longer had to worry about getting sick from the radiation, as he was immune to it, but he still had to worry about the creatures that lurked in the depths. He had encountered a few of them before, but he had managed to avoid them, as they were more interested in eating each other than in attacking humans. But he still had to be on his guard, as he never knew when one of them might decide to attack. John was a skilled fisherman, and he had managed to make a decent living by selling whatever fish he caught. He was able to provide for himself and his family, and he was thankful for that. But even with his skill, there was still danger in the post-apocalyptic world. He had to be careful not to get too close to the shore, as there were creatures that lurked in the depths, waiting for unsuspecting prey to enter their domain. John had gotten into the habit of carrying a knife with him, just in case he ran into any of those creatures. He had also taken to wearing a protective suit when he went out fishing, as the radiation levels were still quite high in some areas. Despite the dangers, fishing was still John's only way to survive, so he had no choice but to continue doing it. He had to remain vigilant, and he had to be prepared for anything that could happen. John had been fishing for hours, and he was just about to call it a day, when he heard a noise in the distance. He froze, listening intently to see if he could make out what it was. As he listened, he heard a deep, rumbling roar. He knew immediately what it was. It was a creature, one of the monsters that lurked in the depths. He had heard stories of them, but he had never seen one before. He was terrified, but he knew he had to stay and fight if he wanted to survive. John grabbed his knife and prepared himself for battle. He had no idea what he was up against, but he knew he had to be brave. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever was waiting for him. John was relieved to find that the creature was not as large as he had feared. It was a mutated sea creature, but it was still much smaller than he had expected. He was able to fend it off with his knife, and soon enough it was gone. John was relieved that he had managed to survive the encounter, but he was still shaken. He had never encountered something so dangerous before, and he knew he had to be more careful in the future. As he made his way back to shore, John reflected on the post-apocalyptic world. He had managed to survive, but he knew that many others had not been so lucky. He was thankful for the skills he possessed, and he vowed to use them to help others who were in need. John was a fisher in a post-apocalyptic world, and he had managed to survive. He had faced dangers that he had never encountered before, but he had managed to come out on top. He was thankful for his skills and for his luck, and he was determined to make the most of the new world. Emma trudged along the shoreline, the shore of what used to be a sea. Now, it was the glowing sea, a vast expanse of irradiated destruction. The radiation had killed off most of the life in the area, leaving only the hardiest of creatures alive. Emma had been living in the glowing sea since she was a young girl, and she had seen the devastation firsthand. Emma was on her way to a trading post, a place where she could barter goods with the children of Atom, a religious cult that had taken up residence in the glowing sea. According to them, the radiation was a blessing, and they sought to spread their faith to anyone who would listen. As she made her way through the wasteland, she could feel the radiation seeping into her skin. She had heard stories of people who had been exposed to too much radiation, and their bodies had been changed in horrific ways. Emma had no intention of becoming one of those stories, so she was extra vigilant. After several hours of walking, she finally reached the trading post. The children of Atom did not welcome outsiders, but Emma had been trading with them for years and they tolerated her presence. She exchanged her wares for the items the cultists had, and then she made her way back to her home. As she walked, she marveled at the beauty of the glowing sea. The sky was a deep purple, and the water shimmered with a strange, otherworldly light. It was as if the radiation had created an underwater paradise. Emma was about to turn back when she noticed something strange in the distance. It was a large, glowing object, hovering just above the water. She cautiously approached it, and as she got closer, she saw that it was some kind of aircraft. The craft was in bad shape, with several of its panels missing. Emma was about to turn away when she noticed a faint pulse coming from inside. She quickly realized that there was someone inside the craft, and they were alive. She rushed to the craft and peered inside. There was a man inside, and he was in bad shape. He had been exposed to too much radiation, and his skin was beginning to turn a sickly green color. Emma quickly realized that this man was a survivor of the nuclear fallout, and he had been stranded in the glowing sea for years. Emma quickly pulled the man from the craft and brought him back to her home. She nursed him back to health and learned his story. His name was Jake, and he had been a pilot for the military before the war. He had been on a mission to deliver supplies to a military base, but his plane had been shot down by enemy forces. He had been living in the glowing sea ever since, surviving on what little he could scavenge from the wreckage of the war. He had been exposed to too much radiation, and it had changed him in ways he could never have imagined. Now, Emma and Jake were living in the glowing sea together. They had become fast friends, and Emma had found a purpose in helping Jake adjust to his new life. They scavenged what they could, traded with the children of Atom, and found small moments of joy in the midst of the destruction. The glowing sea was not a safe place, but it was a place where Emma and Jake could find hope. The radiation may have changed them, but it could not break their spirit. They were survivors, and they would find a way to make the most of their lives in the glowing sea. The sun was slowly setting in the horizon, painting the sky in a brilliant array of oranges and reds. It was a brief moment of beauty in a world that had become a wasteland. The group of survivors had made their way to a large residential apartment complex, hoping to find a safe place to rest and regroup. The group had been on the move for months, constantly on the lookout for any signs of life. They had managed to stay alive, relying on their wits and strength. But the wasteland was a dangerous place, and they had encountered many dangers along the way. The apartment complex seemed like the perfect place for them to settle in. The building was still standing, and it had been well maintained. The walls were sturdy, and the roof intact. It was a perfect place to hide from the dangers of the wasteland. They quickly set up camp, making sure to fortify the building as best they could. They had scavenged supplies from the surrounding area, and they had enough weapons and ammunition to defend themselves. They also had learned to use the environment to their advantage, using scavenged materials to build traps and barriers. But it was not long before they ran into their first major problem. While scouring the area for supplies, they had stumbled upon a large group of feral ghouls. The creatures were relentless, and they seemed to be everywhere. The survivors had no choice but to fight them off and make their escape. It was then they realized they had a serious problem on their hands. The ghouls seemed to be attracted to the apartment complex, and they were relentless in their pursuit. The group had to find a way to get rid of the ghouls, or else they would be overrun. They decided to try and draw the ghouls away from the building. They set up a distraction, drawing the creatures away from the area. Then they quickly barricaded the building, making sure the doors and windows were secured. The group was now safe, but their respite was short-lived. The ghouls seemed to be growing in number, and they were becoming more and more aggressive. The group had to find a way to get rid of them, or else they would be surrounded. They discussed their options and eventually decided to set up a trap. They scavenged materials from the surrounding area and used it to build a large cage. Then they set up a bait, luring the creatures into the cage. The plan worked, and the ghouls were eventually captured. The group was relieved, but they still had to figure out what to do with the creatures. After much debate, they decided to relocate the ghouls to a remote location, far away from the apartment complex. The group was exhausted from the ordeal, but they had finally found a place of safety. They were relieved to have a secure base of operations, and they could now focus on finding a way to survive in the wasteland. They continued to scavenge for supplies and explore the area, and eventually they stumbled upon a small settlement. The settlement was mostly intact, and it had been fortified. The people of the settlement welcomed the group with open arms, and they were able to rest and recuperate. The group eventually settled into the settlement, and they were able to start rebuilding their lives. They were now safe, and the dangers of the wasteland seemed far away. But they had not forgotten the feral ghouls, and they soon found out that the creatures had become a problem for other settlements as well. The group decided to take action, and they set up a network of scouts and patrols to keep an eye on the ghouls. They soon found out that the ghouls were migrating to a nearby city, and they were able to organize a large task force to take on the creatures. They were able to successfully drive the ghouls away from the city, and the survivors were able to return to their settlement in peace. The group had finally found a place of safety, and they were able to start rebuilding their lives. They had faced many dangers in the wasteland, but they had managed to overcome them. They had found a place of safety, and they were able to live in peace.